Thank you, and welcome to this presentation on the key economic drivers of the horticulture industry and its linkages to the rest of the Australian economy. Okay. No, that wasn't the right one. We'll try that. Okay. And so the background to this presentation is that Horticulture Innovation Australia Limited commissioned my consultancy, Independent Economics, to model the interrelationship between vegetable growing and the Australian economy. The study was undertaken during the current financial year, and it focused on the parts of the industry subject to the vegetable levy and the potato levy, which I'm just going to refer to as levied vegetables. So I'm aware today that we have a broader audience, so in this presentation I'll also range more widely and make some comments on the horticulture industry in general. AUSVEG worked closely with Independent Economics throughout this study, so I'd like to acknowledge their assistance. And this today actually is the first public airing of the study. There's also a summary report on the study produced for AUSVEG, as well as the full report produced for HAA Limited. Working with AUSVEG, we developed 7 what-if scenarios focusing on major concerns of the vegetable growing industry. The first of these was what would be the impacts if the GST were broadened to include basic food, which of course is currently GST free. The second, and this harks back to an earlier session with the spread of FTA agreements, what's the impacts on the industry of greater export market access, focusing particularly on levied vegetables? Thirdly, given the health benefits of fresh vegetables, what would be the impacts if the government introduced a subsidy of 5% on local sales to consumers of levied fresh vegetables or some equivalent kind of in-kind assistance? The fourth what-if scenario, given the threat to the industry from import competition, what if prices for imported vegetables were to fall by 10%? How would that impact the local industry? The fifth scenario, given the issue of biosecurity, would be what would be the impacts of an outbreak of disease affecting levied vegetable growing? The sixth, if the government decided as a budget improvement measure to withdraw the diesel fuel rebate currently available to agriculture, thus raising the costs of the industry, what would be the impacts of that? And finally, if there was extra government R&D funding sufficient to boost productivity in levied vegetable growing by 5%, what would the impacts of that be? So they're the 7 scenarios that we considered. 2 of these scenarios, the GST on basic foods and the withdrawal of the diesel fuel rebate for agriculture, are changes which affect agriculture generally. The other 5 scenarios are all to do specifically with changes affecting levied vegetable growing. Okay, so to assess the impacts of these scenarios, we used a long-run model of the economy. I won't go into the details of that today, obviously, but it divides the Australian economy into 288 industries. And for this study, we worked with AUSVEG to develop the particular vegetable growing and processing industries, of which there are 10. So this gives us a model which gives us a far more detailed picture of the vegetable growing and processing industry than in any other model of the Australian economy. And we can use this model to look at the effects of the 7 scenarios that I've outlined on the Australian economy, on the vegetable industry, and on the regional economies where the vegetable industry plays an important role. So I'm now going to step through those three effects. Beginning firstly with the impacts on the Australian economy. I've gone one too far. Yeah. And with any economic change, the first question the government always asks is, what will be the impacts on its budget? Well, if the government were to extend the GST to cover basic foods, it would raise roughly an extra $5.4 billion annually in revenue. If it were to remove the diesel fuel rebate for agriculture only, the budget would benefit by about $1 billion annually. And if it were to introduce the 5% subsidy on consumer sales of levied fresh vegetables, that would cost it about $300 million annually. The other four scenarios don't directly impact on the budget, and they just have minor indirect impacts. As for the impacts on the agriculture industry generally, the two scenarios which impact on the agriculture industry broadly, namely removing the diesel fuel rebate for agriculture and extending GST to basic foods, have the biggest impacts on agriculture, as you would expect, with losses of agriculture output of nearly 2% in the case of extending the GST to basic foods, or 1% if the diesel fuel rebate were to go. The other scenarios which are impacting only on levied vegetables have smaller impacts on agriculture generally, as you would expect. All of these scenarios mainly affect agriculture. So if you turn to the effects on GST, on GDP in the economy as a whole, the impacts in percentage terms, of course, are smaller. Economists are particularly interested in the effects of economic changes on consumer living standards, and this chart sort of summarises those impacts. Firstly, of course, if you were to extend the GST to include basic foods, consumers would be worse off, which is what the chart's showing. However, it would make the GST a more efficient tax by giving it a broader base, and actually the negative impacts on consumers would be greater by raising the same amount of revenue with other methods. So that would actually be a relatively efficient method of raising additional revenue. So from a public interest test, broadening the GST base would be a good thing, even though it would be bad for vegetable growers, obviously. The second scenario, involving better access to export markets, is a win for both vegetable growers and for the economy generally. The third scenario of a subsidy on consumption of fresh vegetables, the modelling shows a broadly neutral impact, but it doesn't take into account the health benefits of consumers eating more fresh vegetables, and if we factored that in, it would be showing a positive impact. The fourth scenario, which was lower vegetable import prices. That would actually be good for consumers but bad for vegetable growers, as you might expect. The fifth scenario, the outbreak of disease, would be bad for both consumers and vegetable growers. The sixth scenario, removal of the diesel fuel rebate, well, obviously would be bad for vegetable growers. It's also bad for the economy. There's no justification for imposing a diesel tax for on-farm use of diesel fuel. The justification for a diesel fuel tax is because of the costs associated with road use, not off-road use. And the final measure was if we could boost productivity by 5% in levied vegetable growing through increased R&D expenditure, well, that would be good for the vegetable industry and good for the economy. In terms of the impacts on the vegetable industry itself now, starting with the GST, if it was to extend to basic foods, and that's something that has been talked about in the current tax reform debate prompted by the government's white paper. I guess the first thing to understand is some parts of the vegetable industry would not be affected. Exports of vegetables would remain GST free, and where vegetables are currently used in snack foods or are served in restaurants, for example, they're already in effect subject to GST further down the supply chain. So the effects of extending GST to basic food would only be felt in cases where vegetables are sold locally and are not served or used in snack foods. That, however, unfortunately does cover the majority of vegetable production. With the higher prices that would result from applying GST, it's estimated that production of levied vegetables would be down by 3 to 5%, with similar impacts for processed vegetables. In terms of other areas of agriculture outside of levied vegetables, or other areas of horticulture, I should say, plants and flower growing wouldn't be particularly affected as they're already subject to GST. Non-levied vegetables such as mushrooms, tomatoes and onions would have a negative impact, as would fruit and nuts. In general, the negative impacts on production are estimated to be the order of 3 to 5%, because higher prices from the spread of GST would discourage consumption. Okay. Moving on to greater export market access, and this would be of benefit particularly for the areas of the vegetable industry that are more engaged in exports already, and that includes undercover levied vegetable production and also dried vegetables. The free trade agreements have already been discussed earlier today, so I won't go into that in further detail. A government subsidy of 5% on consumer sales of levied vegetables would significantly stimulate demand, with gains in production estimated in the range of 2 to 5%. It would not affect production much of processed vegetables because it's assumed the subsidy only applies to vegetables that are sold fresh. Lower import prices. There is, of course, significant import competition for processed vegetables, particularly from New Zealand and Italy. So if the price of those imports were to fall further, some parts of the vegetable industry would be affected, particularly processed vegetables, and in terms of fresh vegetable production, levied undercover vegetables. Moving on to a disease outbreak, and here the disease outbreak is assumed to be fairly severe, resulting in a loss in land productivity of 20% in levied vegetable growing, which translates to about a 5% overall loss of productivity, leading to higher prices. This would impact particularly on parts of the vegetable industry that are exposed to trade and therefore not easily able to increase their prices in response to higher unit costs. And again, we see levied undercover vegetable growing being most affected by a disease outbreak. Withdrawal of the diesel fuel rebate obviously would increase costs generally in agriculture, including in horticulture. And this chart shows the estimated loss of production in levied vegetable growing. Moving on to other areas of horticulture, there are similar losses of production, the order of around 0.5% or so across nursery and floriculture, mushroom growing, so on, and a bit larger at around 1% for fruit and nut tree growing. Finally, a productivity gain of 5% for levied vegetable growing would result in significant gains in output, particularly again for levied undercover vegetable growing. Okay, moving on to the impacts on regions. Now, the ABS effectively divides Australia into 50 economic regions, so that's going down below the level of just the 8 states and territories. And we can use that regional detail to assess how each region would be affected by these 7 scenarios. Now, when you analyse it, there are 8 regions that are more exposed to vegetable growing than the other 42. So I've combined those 42 into the rest of Australia, and you can see for the rest of Australia the effects on production overall are fairly mild from these 7 different shocks, as you would expect. Moving on, though, to the 8 regions that are most exposed to vegetable growing, and starting off here with the Latrobe Gippsland area in Victoria. Now, these charts show the effects on total production for the region, including not just vegetables but everything else that occurs in the region, and they take into account both the direct impacts of changes in vegetable production as well as the indirect impacts, because when vegetable growing changes, that also affects, of course, wholesale, retail trade, transport trade. There are effects transport. There's effects all along the supply chain, which the modelling takes into account, as well as effects on vegetable processing. It turns out that the Latrobe Gippsland area, which grows levied vegetables significantly, also has significant dairy cattle industry, is one of the top 4 regions in Australia in terms of the negative impacts of these levied vegetable scenarios. The northwest area of Victoria, leafy vegetable growing is also significant, as is wheat, barley, grapes and almonds. Its exposure to vegetable growing is a bit less than for the Latrobe Gippsland, and so the effects on it of the shocks to leafy vegetable growing are in the mid-range, not as marked as in Latrobe Gippsland. The Mackay region in Queensland is also a significant grower of leafy vegetables, as well. Beef cattle is also important, but bigger than all of that is the coal industry, which is very large in the Mackay district, and to some extent in the modelling we see effects on agriculture being offset in the coal industry via impacts on the exchange rate. So the effects of the changes to vegetable production from the various scenarios are disguised by the very large coal industry in Mackay, so it's the least of these regions affected. Toowoomba, vegetable growing is important in Toowoomba. In fact, it's the most important agricultural activity in the Toowoomba region, and we see puts Toowoomba in the top 4 regions for being impacted by changes in the vegetable growing industry. Moving on to Wide Bay region, again in Queensland, leafy vegetable growing is important, as is beef cattle, and again the Wide Bay region is one of the 4 top regions in Australia that's exposed to changes affecting the vegetable growing industry. Turning now to South Australia, where potato growing in the southeast is important, along with production of wine grapes and wheat, and it again is one of the top 4 regions for being impacted by changes in the vegetable growing industry. Moving to Western Australia in Bunbury, where vegetable growing is important as a dairy cattle, it falls into the mid-range in terms of impacts of changes in the vegetable growing industry. And finally in Tasmania, in the west and northwest region, potato growing and dairy cattle are both important, and it again falls into the mid-range in terms of impacts. So the key findings of this study then are in terms of the impacts on consumers. There are positive impacts for consumers for extending GST to basic foods rather than increasing taxes in other ways, from greater export market access for vegetables, for lower import prices for imported vegetables, and for higher productivity in vegetable growing. It'd be bad for consumers if the diesel fuel rebate were withdrawn from agriculture, or if there was a vegetable disease outbreak. So that's the interest of consumers. In terms of the industry, the shocks with the biggest impacts are the 4 that are highlighted there in red. Introduction of GST on basic foods would be a significant negative for the industry, with losses of output of 3 to 5%. That's also the case for a vegetable disease outbreak. On the other hand, a 5% government subsidy or a 5% boost to productivity would lead to production gains of 3 to 5%. The other 3 changes have smaller effects. Greater export market access would be a positive for the industry. Lower import prices obviously would be a negative, as would withdrawal of the diesel fuel rebate. And in terms of the regional impacts, when something happens that impacts directly on the vegetable industry, the 4 regions of Australia where the strongest effects are felt are Latrobe Gippsland in Victoria, Toowoomba in Queensland, Wide Bay in Queensland, and the southeast region of South Australia. But there are also significant effects in northwest Victoria, in Bunbury in Western Australia, and in the western northwest of Tasmania, the smallest effects in Mackay in Queensland. I should also mention that vegetable growing is also quite significant in the regions of Greater Melbourne, Greater Perth and Greater Brisbane. However, those capital city economies are relatively very big economies, and so the impacts in percentage terms in those economies is relatively small from the shocks. And then finally, the other major finding of the study is in terms of linkages to other industries. When vegetable growing is affected, other industries that tend to also be affected in a similar way are vegetable processing, retail trade, wholesale trade and transport. Thank you.